My name is Alex Russell. I am a retired professor of oil and gas accounting. I have worked at various universities throughout Scotland. My area of expertise has been oil and gas accounting. I have chaired the Oil Industry Finance Association Committee, the body that looks after the accounting issues for the North Sea oil and gas industry in the UK for as many years as I care to remember. I'm now retired from that as well. It's an interesting question. Perhaps there's a difference between the perception of people in the central belt and the southern belt compared to of what people in Aberdeen are like. I have worked in Edinburgh, worked in Glasgow, worked in Dundee, and worked in Aberdeen, and there isn't that big a difference. I think it's a difference of perception. Because of that difference, I think that Aberdeen has been left to fend for itself a lot of the time, both by the government and by the other areas of Scotland. They have become very resilient at doing that in Aberdeen, and I have been very impressed by what I've seen here. In particular, there's a focus on certain areas that require research to be carried out, whether it's agricultural research, food and nutrition research, life sciences. The Aberdeen is the biggest, has the biggest concentration of life scientists in the UK per city. And oil and gas, of course, is central to the economy in Aberdeen as well. But it's not an economy as diverse as some of the other economies in Scotland, other areas' economies. It's a very successful economy. In fact, it's probably the most successful per capita in Scotland. The GVA, the gross value added figures tell us that. There's been a slight dip latterly since 2014, but again, Aberdeen is still, I think, right up there. It's a very high cost economy as well as being a high value economy. Because of that, you find that you have very high costs of hotels, or had very high cost of hotels in Aberdeen. You had very high house values as well, which means that certain people would benefit a lot. The high earners would benefit a lot, but you will get a discrepancy between what the state of the economy has on low earners compared to the high earners. So again, I would hope that in the future that can be remedied, but we can talk about that later if you like. It's probably a society which is less, or has been less, sympathetic towards the lower paid compared to people in Glasgow or Dundee, for example. But again, that could be part of the fact that you have much bigger populations in Glasgow and Edinburgh, for example. It has to be central going forward to how the economy develops in Aberdeen, that it is more inclusive, and we do not have anything that can destroy the reputation of Aberdeen, and looking wider across Scotland can destroy the reputation of Scotland. At the moment, we are designated the drugs capital, Scotland, the drugs capital of Europe, the worst in Europe. That has to change, has to be a priority, for example. We can do that. It will not take a lot of effort to do it if we have it within our own control to do that. It's been absolutely crucial. We have had huge investments brought into the region from the oil and gas companies coming in. Of course, for every job created in the oil sector, you get maybe 10 other jobs created elsewhere. For example, in 2014, we had 460,000 across the UK jobs that depend on the North Sea oil industry operating. So that's a huge number of jobs dependent on the North Sea oil and gas industry. Aberdeen has had what I would term a perhaps myopic and short-term benefit that could have been an awful lot higher. But what the situation would have been without the North Sea oil and gas is unclear. Aberdeen would certainly have had to be more diverse in its approach, and I think it would still have been a triumph, really. I think the mindset of people in Aberdeen is such that they are innovative, they look for opportunities, and they do not depend as heavily on other people making decisions as I think happens in the rest of Scotland. I mean, it's a tragedy of epic proportions what's happened to North Sea oil. I can understand why oil companies have done what they've done. I can understand why the UK government have done what they've done. I don't understand why Scotland accepted what has happened. Initially, Westminster, I believe, misled Scotland about the extent of the impact that North Sea oil would have on Scotland, bearing in mind that 90% of the oil lies offshore in Scottish territory. And it only emerged after the 30-year secrecy rule came to an end that they had actually withheld information. Had that information been available, I believe that it would have been certainly a very close decision about whether we went for independence in 1975, and I certainly would have voted for independence then. Had that happened, we would not be sitting here today in the situation we are in with our economy. It would be radically different. Again, we can talk about that later. The basic premise of the UK government was, let's leave it to the multinational oil companies to take control. We actually had a national oil company, Britoil, and I think BP was also a national company at one point. And we didn't follow the line of Norway, for example. We said, no, let's leave it to the multinational oil companies. They know best. Well, they do know best. They know what is good for them. They take decisions that are in their interests, and they have been very successful at doing that. That doesn't mean that Scotland and the UK haven't benefited from the revenue that's been generated. We have, but not to the extent that that should have been. Again, I can talk about that later if you like. The other policy decision taken by the UK government was, let's not worry about the price of oil, let's worry about getting oil out, getting gas out and selling it for whatever we can sell it at as quickly as possible. We need to reduce the national debt, we need to fund other ventures for example, getting involved in affairs worldwide, and in even making sure that our nuclear deterrent is up to date, that we shouldn't have been doing. Our priorities have been wrong on that. The oil and gas, the Oil and Gas UK, the body that looks after the interests of North Sea oil industry, have been very effective in making political stances about what the taxation should be to encourage investment in the North Sea. They've been very effective in, again, making sure that their voice is heard politically. One consequence of that is that we had very high wage structures in the oil industry as well. So they paid well, and of course the local economy benefited from high wages. People would spend in the area. For every 1,000 jobs there are associated with the North Sea oil industry, 38% of those would be in Scotland, approximately. The rest would be in England, which again makes you think, when all the oil is basically in Scotland, why the jobs are so widely dispersed. The taxation, I remember in the early days, I think out of maybe 100 fields, only 2 were actually paying any tax at one point. They were paying high rates of tax because they were the big field, Brent and Forties. And again, they were quite highly taxed at that stage, but but over the years that has been eroded. They've been very effective in reducing the tax that is paid to Westminster. Over the years, approximately 460 billion pounds of tax has been paid to the Exchequer. That's tax that hasn't gone to Scotland, it's gone to the Exchequer. The bulk of that has been spent in England, in London, and again has been the saviour of the economy of the UK, in fact. So there has been benefit. You've had a Aberdeen construction industries and other areas who have benefited from the spin-offs from the oil industry in Scotland. But sad to relate, the actual revenue that could have been acquired by Scotland is a lot less than it should have been, and the bulk of the revenue has gone to England. And I think that's a shame. Yeah, Norway is a good example to look at for a comparator situation. We had a Statoil created with about a 63% holding by the Norwegian government. You had a higher rate of tax imposed on oil companies in the North Sea. You had a much more staggered approach to development of the reserves as well. It wasn't just get the oil and gas out, it was a socially aware policy. In other words, this oil has taken how many millions, if not billions of years to accumulate. Why have one generation take all the benefits? Why not stagger it over the years? And again, that's a shame that didn't happen. But the production from Norway over the same period has been approximately the same as in the UK. The revenue has been double what has gone to the UK. Not only that, the money acquired has gone into an oil fund, which now stands at over $1 trillion. And that has perhaps controversially been used in many ways. I believe that they now own equity holdings in over 9,000 public limited companies. In fact, on average, I believe they own about 1.4% of every worldwide public limited company. They are huge. They are almost controlling the actions or having a huge stake in the free market set by that we hold up as being the ideal vehicle for running our economy, which of course it isn't. Oil companies are the richest richest companies on the go. They are not poor by any means. If you listen to their pleading for lower taxation in the UK, you would think that they were on their knees, and that clearly is not the case. It is a real pity that Scotland didn't have an oil fund, or the UK even didn't have an oil fund. Had we been independent, I am absolutely sure we would have had an oil fund. We did belatedly have in Shetland an oil fund started that's only for the benefit of Shetland, which has been tremendously successful. They are now one of the most successful per capita economy in Scotland and Shetland because of that oil fund. And that could have been, what happened in Norway should have been replicated in Scotland. Had it been the case, Scotland now, I believe, would be the wealthiest country in Europe, and Aberdeen would be the wealthiest city in Europe had Scotland had full control as an independent country over all the oil that lay in its waters. Absolutely should have that. The other thing that's worth mentioning at this stage is that the 460 billion that has gone to the Exchequer and not to Scotland is in effect the birthright of every person in Scotland being used to reduce the national debt. And my argument for any future arguments over splitting the cost of the remaining national debt between Scotland and the rest of the UK is Scotland has already paid that in the form of lost revenue from the oil and gas. And I think on a fair and just analysis, that should be what happens.
So that would be your negotiation?
That would be my initial stance by far, yes.
Can I interrupt just a wee moment?
Well, it's a sore point in Brexit, isn't it? We were promised in the 2014 India ref that the one way to remain in the EU would be to vote no. That was the political stance of Westminster and politicians in Scotland as well. So people voted no, and then suddenly we've been taken out of the EU despite Scotland voting to remain in the EU. It's difficult to make up the situation, and to then, regardless of whether it's a deal or no deal exit from the EU, the cost to Scotland is high, will be high, and I'm not sure how it will be resolved. Scotland depends on non-British people coming in to take jobs. We need the right people coming in as well. I've already mentioned that research is at the heart of the local economy in Aberdeen. We need people of high calibre coming in. If there's uncertainty about what the status will be for people if they come in, they're not going to come here. So we're potentially at a big disadvantage by Brexit happening the way it appears to be happening. There was an opportunity to try to keep in the customs union and in the free market, but they don't want that. I think there has to be an analysis done at some point about who actually gains from the Brexit that's being proposed. I think you'll find that there will be people who will make millions, if not billions, out of it. I want to know if they were actually behind what has happened. I don't believe for a moment that if we had another vote on Brexit that we'd get the same outcome. I think people would see through it now for what it was. However, we are where we are. Aberdeen will have to be even more resilient and, if at all possible, strike deals on its own with the rest of Europe. I hope that will be possible, but it's not a good situation to be in, and we shouldn't be in this situation. Following the Wood Review and the setting up the Oil and Gas Authority, the regulator, I mean the mantra that's forthcoming from the Oil and Gas Authority is maximisation of economic return. And that sounds great. You know, well, we've got oil and gas out there. It's not as much as there was before, although it's still arguably 20 billion barrels of oil still out there that's recoverable. Let's get it out. And that has been what's happening. It was claimed at one point when oil was $110 a barrel that it's uneconomic. We can't possibly do it at that price. And that was the whole point of the Wood Review and setting up the Oil and Gas Authority. Oil is now just over $60 a barrel, and despite that, we are insisting, the Oil and Gas Authority are insisting, the UK government's insisting, that oil is extracted as quickly as possible from wherever it can be extracted, regardless of whether it makes a profit or not. In other words, no tax is going to the exchequer out of it. All that's happening is maximising the shareholder wealth of oil companies, maximising their return for past investment, and the oil that will become much more economically viable in the future, if we want to take it out in the future, when the oil price rebounds again, is being given away. I cannot get my head around why we're doing that. The argument will be, well, we still have a lot of jobs that are being created through taking out the oil. But the cost of giving away what is our heritage is too high, and it really doesn't make sense. Particularly when the cost of taking it out, the cost of running the Oil and Gas Authority is eye-watering. It's supposed to be minimising costs, but if you look at the salaries of some of the people in the Oil and Gas Authority, they're the highest paid people anywhere. So again, there's an inconsistency there. I can understand why oil companies are keen to continue doing what they're doing. The big oil companies, of course, are diversifying. They're selling the smaller fields and getting as much money out of that as they can. Worries me slightly what then happens when decommissioning has to take place, of course, because you then may have smaller companies in charge or responsible for that decommissioning. Although the legal argument there is a bit unclear. It may well be that the original owners would still have to do the decommissioning. But again, the Oil and Gas Authority have stepped in, Oil and Gas UK have stepped in to say, and the UK government have stepped in to say, no, let's minimise the cost of decommissioning. In other words, let's find the cheapest possible way of decommissioning. And in effect, that has resulted in Shell, for example, saying on the Brent structure, why don't we just take off the top side, take it down to England for decommissioning. Again, you couldn't make it up. Or to Turkey, you couldn't make it up. And leave the rest because, well, it would do more environmental damage to remove it. My estimate of the total cost of cleaning up what I claim would be the legally responsible duty for oil companies to clean up is more like £70 billion. If that money is spent, that is jobs being created in Scotland, jobs that would benefit for years and years and years to come, Scotland. If you follow the minimalist approach of leaving the North Sea as a scrapyard for the remnants of the oil industry, and who knows what damage that will do in the future. It really is unclear. Again, it's detrimental to Scotland and to the heritage of the people in Scotland, and certainly wouldn't in the United States, for example. If oil companies create a mess, they clear up the mess. As you could see with what happened to BP in the spill in the Gulf of Mexico. So it needs to be highlighted more than it has already been highlighted. People need to be aware of what's happening there in decommissioning. If a rig, an oil well, infrastructure has been used in Scotland, it makes sense for it to be decommissioned in Scotland. Brought ashore, cleaned up and recycled, money brought back that way. I can understand why the UK government are doing what they're doing, because they agreed to pay 50% of the decommissioning cost through pressure, again, by Oil and Gas UK. It's as if the oil companies are so short of cash that they couldn't pay for the decommissioning. Of course they could pay for the decommissioning. They are the richest companies in the world. If we continue to allow them to do what they're doing, the North Sea will be a scrapyard, but big companies will be saving billions of pounds. Now, at some point, there's every likelihood that that will have to be spent on cleaning up the mess that's still there. If the oil companies don't want to do it, I believe that if Scotland were an independent country, it would insist that the oil companies pay over to Scotland the cost of cleaning up the oil. We'll save you all the effort, just give us the money, and that's what you agreed to do. That's what should have been happening in the accounts of the oil companies. They should have been making provision for what was the legally liable cost of decommission, which again I think is £70 billion. I've heard that quoted before, and even that could be an underestimate. Only a fraction of that will actually take place to the detriment of Scotland, both in revenue, both in jobs, both in spin-off jobs. So going forward, I would argue, forget about toppling oil rigs. Let's do what you should have done legally, or give us the money, and we will invest that in renewables or in other ways. We'll carry out the research that we need to carry out to make sure that the economy of Scotland will survive going forward. It's short-term return, not to the country, but to the oil companies. And who runs the country? Is it the multinational oil companies, or multinational companies in general? Yes, that is what's happening. Not only that, when we leave things to rot, scrapyard, when we extract every drop of oil we can, even though it's being done at a loss, we are sending out a message to every other country that has oil that they can do the same. They will just say, well, if it's good enough for the UK, it's good enough for us. And we won't be able to complain about that. If we want every drop of oil extracted, wherever it exists, then you can forget about global warming being restricted. It will basically go right through the roof. I think the way forward for Scotland is to take a moral and ethical stance and do what we should be doing the right thing by the people in Scotland and by the people elsewhere who I think you may find suffer even more from their association with oil companies. You just have to look at some of the pollution that's being caused elsewhere, and by the legislation that's being attempted to get a remedy for that. I believe Scotland is better than that, and the UK should be better than that. Yeah. Well, had I been in charge of things, when the oil price sank to $55 a barrel or $60 a barrel, I would have said, let's stop producing at this stage. It doesn't make sense. It's not like if you stop production, you won't be able to go back to it. You're not mothballing it. That could have been done. I would then have said, let's look at how we can transition from oil. I mean, when you think about the bigger picture, I mean, surely there is a much better use for oil than burning it. Take it out, burn it as fuel. There will be a big cost to pay from retribution in the future when you suddenly realise what better use could have been made of that oil. It's like taking the family silver, and instead of making proper use of it, you scrap it, you melt it down and you give it away. Going forward, I believe that we should continue to investigate ways of having renewable energy in a much cleaner way than we have at the moment. I don't have the answers, but I know that the research skills and the innovation that the oil industry itself has displayed could be used to better effect. What we cannot do is leave it up to the oil companies and the multinational companies to do it. They look after themselves. They are answerable to their shareholders, who have a different set of priorities than what should be the national priorities of the people of Scotland or the people of the UK. Now, if the UK decide that they are happy just maximising shareholder wealth for oil companies and other rich people, I'm not surprised. They have demonstrated that that's what they're good at doing, and that's because a lot of the people in charge are, let's say, Oregonians and millionaires. It must have the biggest proportion of government millionaires anywhere in the world in the UK. So they're looking after themselves. We need better control over the resources in Scotland. Bear in mind that if you take into consideration the offshore region of Scotland and the 1/3 land mass of Scotland, when you add the two together, Scotland is really in control or should have the rights to more than 50% of the resources of the United Kingdom. We own more than 50% of that, offshore, onshore. That barely gets a mention. We need a better return from any use of those assets that we have. And I'm sure as an independent country we could go to town on it. We have the skills, the enthusiasm and the ability to do it ourselves. We don't need other people telling us what to do. Why would we want it any other way? I cannot get my head around people being given the choice. Do you want to make your own decisions over 50% of the resources of the United Kingdom yourself, or do you want us to make them for you like we have done in the past? And you well know what the outcome of that has been. Again, you'd have to have a proper research analysis undertaken of exactly what the resources were at our disposal, because it's huge. I mean, we own more than 50% of what arguably is in the North Sea.
Are we doing that at all now? Are we auditing our resources at this point? Is that something the Scottish Government are doing?
The Oil and Gas Authority try to find out any dregs of oil that they feel they can exploit, regardless of the cost of doing that. But as a whole, I don't think we are doing that. There will be a lot more resources offshore and onshore. Thank goodness. I mean, if you go back to 2014 when the crisis started, why did that happen? One of the major reasons for that was the manipulation of the oil price by the United States. Prior to 2014, you had oil price manipulation to drive up the cost of oil, despite the fact that OPEC had been pilloried in the past for doing precisely that. Why did that happen? It was done either by making sure that countries like Iraq, Iran, Libya are unable to actually exploit their oil reserves. And you can think about what the consequence of that has been, in loss of life or whatever. But it was done to make sure that fracking in the United States became viable. Up until then, it was unviable to do fracking. But suddenly it became viable. And in 2014, when oil was about $110 a barrel, you had over 100 wells per week or per day started in the United States, just on fracking. In other words, they devastated the price of oil by overproducing. They became the world's biggest producer of oil and gas from fracking. It didn't work out the way they thought it would work out. A lot of the fracking companies have gone into liquidation, and it's seen more or less as a disaster now, I believe. Nevertheless, today, you're actually having reports that the United States are about to do exactly the same again. They are going to produce as much oil as they can. That's reported today. So again, you're going to have an even bigger drop in oil price. I'm not quite sure why they're doing that now, but they are about to do it. The consequence of that is in Aberdeen, for example, we had a drop in employment in 2017 go from 78% down to 70%. It's gone up again slightly now. But more than that, in 2014 there were 460,000 people, jobs across the UK dependent on the North Sea oil industry. Today we have, I think, roughly 280,000 jobs dependent on what's happening. That's a colossal drop.
How much has Aberdeen shouldered that?
Aberdeen Scotland will shoulder there's about 60,000 jobs in Scotland, and the bulk of that will be in Aberdeen.
I'll just move back over.
Yeah, sure.
And that's not directly offshore. Offshore it's about 24,000, but it's jobs that depend on the North. It's construction, metal work, even things like hotels and things. Yeah. Going forward, we need to look at our areas of strength in Scotland if we want to drive the economy forward. We need to focus on, we're in the most beautiful part of the world, really, in Aberdeen. We have an environment that is to die for. Why is tourism not a lot higher than it should be, than it is? It should be a lot higher. We need to focus on how we do that. Life sciences, we need to play to our strengths there again as well. Food and nutrition, we carry out great research. Agricultural research, we do that as well. We need to diversify. We need to go into high technology. Let's get into the games industry. Let's go for it. Just say, look, you have it might be Dundee's bang, but let's compete. Let's compete. But we don't need to do it in isolation. We can have our own plans, and we need our own plans. But again, let's think of Scotland as a whole. We need to eradicate the poverty that's in Scotland. We need to eradicate the obesity that's in parts of Scotland. We need to eradicate the housing disaster that's in parts of Scotland. We can do that, but we're only going to do that if we have control over our own decision making and our own resources. I believe fervently that we should take the responsibility for that, and I'm sure we'd make a great success of it. I think it's in the nature of Scotland. I think they're one of the most caring people imaginable. There'll be variations across Scotland. When I lived in Glasgow, you were almost embarrassed by the over-friendliness of Glaswegians. They would embrace you. You work in Edinburgh, you've a much cooler relationship, much more we know more about things than you do. We went to a public school, for example. We're finance people, we're banking people, despite the fact that banking people were the people that caused the first economic disaster. I could get on to the Royal Bank of Scotland saying, why do we have a Royal Bank of Scotland that has its headquarters outside Scotland? Why do we have a bank, a National Bank of the United Kingdom that's called the Bank of England? I mean, unacceptable practices make the decision to go for independence an easy one. The only way that people can be persuaded not to do that is fear. Oh, you won't have your pension, or your house price will drop. It won't. We need to counter the fear argument that took place last time, and I believe we can do that simply by pointing out that we would own more than 50% of the resource generation capability of the United Kingdom, with about 1/8 of the population.
And that we would plan and resource.
We would plan, and we would not put barriers on people joining us in Scotland. We need people coming in from the EU. The UK will stop us doing that. We need, if it was in our own control, we would be much more open about it. And I'm sure in the blink of an eye, we'd be again members of the European Union.
Gas industry.
The more planning that goes into it, the better. I think a regional plan is definitely the way forward. Not only for the North Sea, but for every facet of life in Scotland, you need proper planning, and with an objective to maximise welfare and happiness as well as GDP in Scotland, and having an economic system that almost relies upon everyone striving to increase their GDP every year. It can't happen. Everyone can't keep doing better. Someone does better, someone does worse. That's the way the system works. We need to change that. If you want to reduce suicide rates, if you want to reduce drug taking, if you want to reduce just bad feeling of people towards other people, then you need more equality taking place. I could be quite radical in the things that I would prefer to happen, but at this stage I would say yes, let's just plan for a better society than we have at the moment. And I'm not saying you don't worry about GDP. You have to play the game as well. Yeah. Scotland can play that game better than anyone else, given entrepreneurial spirit that we have. And I think we need to take the step and just demonstrate that would be the case. Certain fields, the big fields in the UK, were every bit as profitable as any Norwegian field. It was easy to get out, basically. Companies made lots of profit. I don't think that argument stands. I think the heyday of the big finds have gone anyway. All I know is that Norway had double the revenue. That's not because the cost was 50% cheaper, it was because the taxation was dearer. So that argument doesn't faze me. Absolutely, there should be the equivalent of an oil fund, a sovereign fund set up in the region, particularly given the richness that is still there. The fact that we can go to town on renewable energy, whether it's wind generation or wave generation or some other innovative way of generating energy, rather than relying on the new companies that are being formed to give handouts to the local economy. If we were in control of the situation, we could make it mandatory that a fund to be set up to make sure that you have continuity and sustainability in the generation of renewable energy. It's a no-brainer, but it should happen, and certainly should happen, rather than simply handing out subsidies. Let's get a return on it as well, as long as the companies get a fair return, and let's not leave it to them to determine what that is. Let's take it into our own hands. You don't want too many think tanks. Possibly you can have a central belt think tank and then an Aberdeen Highland think tank and maybe southern, maybe 3 think tanks. But that would be absolutely brilliant for Aberdeen, because we could take a lead in making sure that the unbelievable wealth of environmental attractiveness in the rest of Highlands of Scotland is better used than it currently is. I think we need much more return to nature there as well. We need much more thought given to the animal life we can have and the birds we can have, rather than simply pandering to the shooting brigade on the estates there. Again, it needs to be thought through. We can certainly make better use of it than we are currently doing. One other thing I forgot to say regarding oil is that following the drop in oil to $55 a barrel, and the realisation by the oil industry and the Oil and Gas Authority and Oil and Gas UK that it's either time to shut up shop or become more efficient, they magically had a 40% increase in the productive capability throughout the industry. Whether that meant they were taking shortcuts or whatever, or just reducing the manpower, people working twice as hard, I'm not sure. But think that one through. What they've actually said or sent a message out is that they had the capability of doing things 40% more efficiently throughout the lifetime of the oil generation. Why didn't they do that? Why wasn't better control over the activities of the oil industry and the Oil and Gas UK, for that matter, taken by the UK government? Had Scotland been independent, I'm sure we would have done that. So forget about your $460 billion take. You add another 40% onto that, and add on even more if you've got higher taxation like Norway had. It's a colossal loss, and that needs to come into the game if you're ever talking about our share of the national debt. We need the skill set and the grit that these people have. I mean, oil people are hard working. They know their own mines. I think they'll listen to reason if they see that there are prospects for them using the talents that they've developed and the experience that they've developed to further the renewable cause, which again we should be taking a world lead on. It should be something we do automatically. I think we'll be saluted for that. And think of the potential export capabilities that we'll be generating as well through having better planning taking place in how we go about things, and using the innovative spirit, entrepreneurial spirit, and ability to handle technology that I think is unique to Scotland in many ways. They will benefit from it, Scotland will benefit from it, and more importantly, the world will benefit from it. It's an opportunity for us to be a world leader. We need to take it.
Without running the risk of exhausting you, Jack, have you got anything? No. Are we all right?
I'm absolutely happy with that.
Brilliant, yeah.
Shall we?
Yeah.
Any final words?
Thank you for having me. There you go.